My name is Ryan Anderson. I'm the president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center. I've been president since February 1st of 2021, so a little over 5 years now. So my involvement with EPPC probably goes back over 20 years now. I did the Tertio Millennio seminar, our Poland program in Krakow, Poland, that George Weigel has been running for 35 years. I did that maybe a year or two after graduating from college, and I guess that was my first formal participation with EPPC. I had brought George Weigel to speak on campus back when I was an undergraduate, so I guess in that sense it goes back even further. And then I worked for a decade at the Heritage Foundation as a senior research fellow, and I would regularly rely on the work that Mary Hassan was doing on transgender ideology and parental rights, the legal work that Ed Whalen was doing on marriage, on religious liberty, on transgender issues. So even before I became president at EPPC, I was very familiar with the scholars, the work that EPPC does, the journals. I had written for the New Atlantis and National Affairs. So I always thought, even while I was a Heritage Fellow, that I could have been and maybe should have been an EPPC scholar, but didn't make the move until 5 years ago. The way that I thought about this was that, I spent the decade of my 20s kind of being educated. Undergraduate, grad school, some fellowships, some kind of apprenticeships in essence. And then the decade of my 30s was spent doing my own research agenda. I wrote a bunch of books, law review articles, essays, things like that. And then for the decade of my 40s, I had this opportunity. I became president when I was 39 years old. And my thought was, all right, I'll spend a decade at least, hopefully more if it's going well. And I would spend a decade taking an institution that all of the bones were solid. EPPC was 45 years old when I became president, had a great legacy, a great reputation, and had great scholars. And so the charge that I got from the Board of Trustees, don't change anything in terms of the mission or the vision or the focus, the priorities, just rejuvenate the place. We don't need to do fundamental changes. We just need to recruit the next generation of EPPC scholars, thinking about, what are today's challenges to human dignity, to human identity, to human flourishing, the challenges that we wrestled in previous iterations. Some of those are behind us. Some of those we're still struggling with, but now they're new challenges. 50 years ago, none of us knew what the T meant in LGBT. And now transgender ideology is front and center. 50 years ago, there was no iPhone. 50 years ago, Al Gore hadn't invented the internet, right? So many new technologies, and thinking through both the opportunities that new technologies bring to us in terms of elevating human flourishing and respecting human dignity, but also the challenges that they bring. We don't want to be Luddites, but we also don't want to be kind of knee-jerk techno, adapters who just whatever the latest technology is, we adapt to it. So what was attractive about this opportunity was take an institution that's already solid and make it better. Take it to the next level. Take it to the next issue set of issue. Take it to. I'll just repeat that. Take it to the next set of issues that need to be wrestled with. And to my mind, what makes EPPC unique is that we're fully socially conservative. We are ecumenically, biblically orthodox. So we have Orthodox Jews, we have Roman Catholics, we have evangelicals. And so we have differences across those religious traditions, but we share a common anthropology. We share a common understanding of the human person. And the thought here was, a biblically serious, morally serious, intellectually serious, social conservative think tank that can be at home in America, taking that into the second, half century of our existence, having it meet the moment of the challenges that we're facing right now. That's a pretty cool opportunity. And so I was flattered when the board interviewed me, when they made the offer. I jumped at the opportunity. The Ethics and Public Policy Center is a community of scholars that's dedicated to promoting a full and a true account of human nature. And what I mean by that is a full and true account of human dignity, of human identity, of human flourishing, and then operationalizing that understanding of human nature and human dignity, both in culture and in policy. So unlike most DC-based think tanks, We have programs that are particularly devoted towards the church, towards religious communities. We have scholars here who their primary audience are pastors and priests or rabbis, and they're trying to help religious communities rise to the occasion, right? New challenges. If you went to seminary 20 years ago, transgender ideology wasn't on the syllabus. You now find yourself the bishop of a diocese. Mary Hassan is the person that's going to help you to equip you for what you need to be doing. But then on the flip side, we also address policymakers, right? Because human dignity, human identity, human flourishing, it's threatened both in culture and in law, and therefore it can be defended both in culture and in law. And so we have scholars that are doing model legislation. We have scholars that are writing amicus briefs. We have scholars that are doing regulatory comments, engaging with the alphabet soup, administrative state, all of the various agencies. So many of the bad things that have threatened human dignity and human identity from the past decade, they didn't come from Congress. They came from the Department of Health and Human Services. That's why we call it the HHS mandate. It comes from the Department of Education, Department of Justice. And so having scholars who can take a sound understanding of the human person and then engage with bad regulations coming out of the administrative state, and then partner with the lawyers, sometimes it's the state AGs, sometimes it's private firms, to then sue over those regulations, file the amicus brief, et cetera, et cetera. It's meant to be a very holistic response to the challenges of the 21st century when it comes to faulty understandings of human nature. The issues that EPPC was working on in the 70s when we were founded, or the 80s, we were a Cold War think tank, and that Cold War has morphed. And so what was originally just Marxism is now cultural Marxism. And you can see how there's a through line on how the mission of EPPC has remained constant, but how it gets applied in different eras of our existence has changed because the threats have changed. And so the way that I think about this is, our mission is to promote a full and a true account of human nature in today, a relatively anti-human era. Like we live in an era that is anti-human, and whether it's the abuses of biotechnologies or new sexual ideologies like transgender ideology, or the violations on religious liberty when it comes to religious communities who simply want to live out the truth about human nature, bad education policies. There are a whole host of areas where EPPC scholars are thinking through what are the biggest threats to human dignity today, and then how can we use our scholarship not just to think great thoughts. Like there are lots of people who have thought great thoughts, written great books, but to do this in a way that'll move the needle, right? How do we operationalize our ideas to have impact? And that could be through amicus briefs, like regulatory comments, moot courts, helping the people who are going to be in the courtroom prepare for those questions, hostile questions from the justices, et cetera, et cetera. But I think our best intersection, the images that I use about a think tank, one is a fish tank and one is a G.I. Joe tank. And the idea is the fish tank, we're scholars who think great thoughts in a tank. The other, we are scholars who take those great thoughts and we put them into action. And I think that's kind of the hallmark of an effective EPPC scholar, is that we can do both of those things. One of the things that we created a few years ago was the Richard John Newhouse Fellowship here at EPPC. And, I had worked for Father Newhouse back when I was an assistant editor at First Things, and Father Newhouse was one of the founding board members of EPPC, and he served on the EPPC board up until he passed away in 2009. And the thought here was we wanted to create the next generation of socially conservative young scholars. So this is kind of, these people all have full-time day jobs working in the Senate, the House, other think tanks, magazines, journals, things like that. And once a month, bring them together for dinner. They hear from an EPPC speaker. We have a retreat every winter. We have a picnic at my farm every spring. And more or less, a one-year experience that then creates a network. So they all get invited back for that picnic so they can, meet earlier class years, more or less to train up the next generation of people who a decade or two from now could be full-time employees at EPPC. And the thought here was that the hallmarks, what we want here are people who aren't squishes, if I can use the vernacular or use the technical term. We want people here who are willing to defend the fullness of truth, not do it in a bombastic way. We don't want bomb throwers. We don't want people who are going to be counterproductive by being over the top. But we also don't want people who are going to be like apologetic and kind of like embarrassed or afraid of what the truth is. So we want cheerful warriors, people who can go into the public square with a smile on their face, explain what the truth is and why it's the truth. Because ultimately, we're in the convert business. Convert business, both in the sense of we would like to see more people in the pews, but also the convert business in that we would like to see people's ideologies change, whether it's about the right to life for the unborn or the right to life for our grandparents, the right to life for people who have disabilities, people who are aging, the elderly, sound understanding of marriage and the family, the importance of mothers and fathers raising their children inside of the marital union. Religious liberty is our first right in the Bill of Rights. All of these things strike me as some of the existential questions that are most at stake at this moment in time. I think there's a huge hunger from this next generation for moral and religious leadership. There are people hungry for the truth because they know that all of the various woke ideologies are false and they're unsatisfying, and it doesn't satisfy their deepest longings, their deepest desires. And unfortunately, what we've seen is a lot of people in positions of authority have silenced themselves. They got intimidated. I would say particularly in the aftermath of Obergefell, there were a lot of social conservative leaders who said, look, we spoke out in defense of marriage and it didn't go well for us, so we're just keeping our mouth shut. And that created a vacuum. And my thought is like, no, we need to speak into that void. People are hungry. It's why you see so many of these podcasters, with millions of listeners, particularly for like young men who feel adrift, somewhat alienated. Now, there are also some bad influencers. I mean, I think there are some influencers who have risen to prominence for all the wrong reasons. And so, part of what we want to do here is that, give people a solid foundation in the truth in a charitable, compelling way, to kind of be an alternative either to those who have gone silent or those who have gone to kind of like radical extremes. So EPPC is somewhat unique in that we have programs meant to equip the grass tops, not the grassroots, right? So there are some groups that are like grassroots action. We want to influence the influencers, and so the way that looks, we have programs that are meant to equip Catholic bishops. Sometimes that'll look like things of drafting pastoral letters on controversial issues. Sometimes that'll look like helping a school, the diocesan school policy, what it should look like on questions of sexuality and gender ideology. And all that's done behind the scenes. No one knows if or what diocese or bishop we might have assisted. But the thought there is that you have people who are on the front lines, people who very much are in pastoral leadership roles, and we might have expertise that we can bring to bear that will equip them to do a better job at their job. We don't need to be the center of attention. We don't need to be getting credit for it. And then something similar is true when it comes to policymakers. The secret in DC is that DC is not run by the politicians that you see on Fox News at night. DC is run by the staffers. The staffers know who to turn to. And so, for the past year, we have had friends of ours inside of the Trump administration who, we are helping try to get good regulations out the door, undo bad regulations that the Biden administration put in place. I serve on the President's Religious Liberty Commission as one of the 13 commissioners, but then we also have a whole host of people who are working with all the various alphabet soup agencies, Capitol Hill agencies. And sometimes it's like an inside-outside game where, we'll be working with the Capitol Hill, so, Senate staffers to prep their bosses to ask questions of someone from the administration. We've done work on this with our study on mifepristone, chemical abortion drug, where we'll be working to get the right questions in front of the right members, the right officials in the administration, to actually get something across the finish line. Because again, we're not trying to do scholarship just for the sake of like padding our CVs. The point here is to actually like change something concretely when it comes to law or culture or both. I think there are some activists that they didn't reason themselves into their perspective, and so you're not going to be able to reason them out of it. And there are some people who are so committed, pro-abortion cause or pro-trans cause, or they think religious liberty is a, quote, license to discriminate, that you can't make much headway. But I've done a lot of campus speaking, particularly at law schools, at universities. And what I have found is that, yes, there are the activists, and the same thing is going to be true in DC circles. But then there are a lot of people who just kind of like, well, this is just like the team that I'm on. And it's not because I'm a true believer, but it's just because, well, I grew up being center left, or and you can kind of prick their conscience. And you can plant seeds of doubt in their own minds about the unborn child in the womb, or about transgender ideology, or about like the Little Sisters of the Poor. Why are you going after this order of Catholic nuns with this mandate to violate their beliefs? And it may be that this is the first time they're actually hearing these opposing arguments. And so I think there is an opportunity for conversation and for persuasion in a way that I do think for some of the more ardent activists, there's an impenetrability there. They're not open to persuasion. But for other people, they are. And I think it's important that we not just write those people off. Right? Someone needs to be trying to persuade those people, because at the end of the day, like we need to make converts, both theologically and politically and culturally. We need more people coming over to the side of the truth on all of these important matters. And that also means like we have to speak in tones and in terms that will be accessible to people who don't already agree with us. I mean, there's a time and a place to go down really, really deep with people who share all of your presuppositions, people who share your worldview. Let me take you deeper and deeper for your own understanding. But there's also a time and a place to speak to people who don't share any of your presuppositions, any of your worldview, and try to convert them. So if I'm speaking at Harvard Law School, I'm going to speak very differently than if I'm speaking at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And I've spoken at both several times, and ultimately I'm defending the same set of truths because the truth doesn't change. But the terms and the tones and just the rhetoric of how I structure my argument is going to look different. And I think that's something that scholars at EPPC are particularly, they have a knack for. Being able to speak both dialects, a vernacular and a second language, something like that, being able to translate for different audiences, being able to speak both theologically and philosophically, the law and sociology, all the various disciplines to kind of weave together a tapestry of the truth. We're unique that from the beginning of our founding 50 years ago, we've not just been a DC think tank. We are a DC think tank, but we realize that culture matters just as much as law. Both of these things matter. I don't think one is upstream and one is downstream. I think they each influence the other for good or for ill. And the heart of culture is cultus, cult, religion. And so we've always had programs for religious communities and for religious leaders, just like we have had programming for political community and political leaders. Some of this is done by the same scholars, right? So if you're an expert on an issue of human anthropology, right, the nature of the human person, you might be one day lending your expertise to help Capitol Hill better understand this issue, a legislative issue, a legal issue, and the next day helping the USCCB. Several of our scholars, either currently or in the past, have served as experts on a USCCB committee or a subcommittee. And to be able to do both, I think, is really important. During Ed Whalen's tenure as president and now as a senior distinguished fellow, his project here was to reform the judiciary. He had been a clerk to Antonin Scalia the year that Planned Parenthood v. Casey was decided. Unfortunately, Justice Scalia was in the dissent in that case. He was in the minority. And I think Ed more or less made it part of his life work to get a Supreme Court that would finally overturn Roe. There are lots of people, obviously, who deserve credit for the Dobbs decision, but I think one of them near the top is Ed Whalen. And it's a result of 20 years at EPPC working to increase the quality of judicial nominees, to then defend those judicial nominees when they're being attacked by leftist activist groups, to get them across the finish line. And the fact that we now have a 6-3 Supreme Court where all of a sudden pro-life laws are being upheld rather than struck down, where all of a sudden religious liberty is being vindicated at the Supreme Court instead of a bunch of losses. I think Ed deserves quite a bit of credit for that. And he did all that work as an EPPC scholar. Two major issues, both law and culture, that EPPC scholars are going to be wrestling with, thinking about, writing, providing thought leadership, legislation leadership, cultural leadership. It strikes me it's going to be end of life and artificial intelligence. And if you look at what's happening in Canada, one of our scholars has been doing, I think, the best work documenting the string of abuses in the euphemism in Canada for, our euphemism is physician-assisted suicide. Their euphemism is medical assistance in dying. And Alexander Aiken has just gone through all of the various abuses, people who have been pressured or coerced, people with disabilities who haven't been offered the counseling and the support that they were promised they would receive, but instead have been told, it's time to end their lives. As the baby boomers reach now retirement and then grow into old age, the social, the cultural, and possibly even the legal pressures on them, where the right to die quickly becomes a duty to die, the familial pressures, that's going to be vitally important. And I'm glad, we have physicians here at EPPC, and we have other policy wonks, theologians, philosophers, ethicists, bioethicists. A lot of people here recognize that this is one of the next major issues and are doing the work now to prepare for it. The other area is AI. And, I don't think anyone is fully up to speed on how transformative these large language models and various AI applications will be. I mean, it's going to have applications for national security and defense policy. It's going to have applications for the labor force. It's going to have applications for education. It's going to have impacts on children, and how to think through all. It's going to have applications for biotechnology, fertility, how to think through what are the humane applications of AI and what are the inhumane applications. What are the age appropriate applications of AI and what are the age inappropriate applications? How do we harness this technology so that we are using a technology rather than a technology actually shaping and manipulating us? And so, we have a variety of scholars focused there. And to my mind, those are two of the new sets of issues that we need to be thinking about and doing work on. But the other issues aren't going away. The abortion debate, especially chemical abortion, that is still, vitally important. Religious liberty, gender ideology. There's a lot to be concerned with. When I became president, I knew we wanted to start something in technology. And so, actually one of the first people I hired, Claire Morell, had, worked in the first Trump administration. And so, I become president February 1st of 2021. So, Biden had just been inaugurated and there were a lot of really talented people from the first Trump administration who were now looking for work. And, Claire had worked at the White House and at the Department of Justice. She comes to us. And her previous work had really focused on like big tech censorship and big tech monopoly or quasi-monopoly. How do we understand the concentrated power of big tech? And then right around that same time, Amazon canceled my book. And, my book on gender ideology had been for sale for 3 years at Amazon while Trump was president, while Bill Barr was the attorney general. And then all of a sudden, it was towards the end of February, they decided the book was hate speech and, they got rid of it. And so early on, it was even called the Big Tech Project at EPPC, and it was focused on big tech censorship. It was focused on the outsized market force that big tech has. But then very quickly, and Claire and I, we both have children and they're small children, and we both kind of came to the realization that the threat here to human dignity isn't just the concentrated market power, but it's to children in particular. And how do we think about these devices that we all carry in our pockets but that now all of these children are carrying in their pockets. And if like adults have trouble with phone addiction, and I think social media can bring out the worst in adults, what is it doing to kids? And so that's when the Big Tech Project became the Technology and Human Flourishing Project. And then at a certain point, it merged with our biotechnology. So now it's, bioethics, technology, and human flourishing, because these things are all of the same cloth. And how we think through biotechnology, how we think about digital technology, how we think through those two things where they intersect, all with human dignity and human flourishing. Some of that was foreseeable. Some of it was you just start working on the issue, and as you peel the onion, you see there are more and more layers, and you get more and more to kind of like what's the core issue. And so we've grown that program. Claire's done really amazing work with model legislation that's been enacted in dozens of states. Published a book with Penguin Random House. Is that work on a second book? And again, some of that was foreseeable. Some of it was organic. And I think that's going to for the next 50 years, that's what it's going to look like. There are certain things that we can talk about today and say, these are the issues for the next 50 years. There are other things that in essence, we're going to stumble into, and we need to be agile to be able to say, all right, this is a new threat. We need to respond. A decade ago, it was scholars at EPPC and myself who were some of the only voices speaking out against gender ideology. Sadly, there were a lot of religious leaders who had spoken out against the redefinition of marriage, and in essence, they stuck their heads up and they got their heads chopped off, and so they were like, "We're going to go quiet on this." And it was Ed Whalen, it was Mary Hassan, it was George Weigel, it was a series of scholars here at EPPC. I was working at Heritage at the time. That's when I was doing my book, When Harry Became Sally. And yes, it required some courage. In hindsight, I don't think it required all that much courage. But when people say, look, courage is the virtue that's necessary to take all the other virtues kind of to the testing point. And I think it was important that there were voices that were credible, that were reasonable, and that were truthful. And now a decade later, people are like, wow, it's a 70-30 issue our way. But a decade ago, it wasn't. And it took work for people to actually do the research, do the writing, do the speaking, do some of those initial, I can remember writing talking points that now have become like the vernacular. Everyone talks this way. And I was like, well, I remember where I was a decade ago thinking through how do we phrase this point. And I think that's, it's important that we have institutions devoted to doing that work for whatever the next issue is going to be. And not just being reactive, but proactive to say, this issue isn't yet prime time here, but we can see it coming. We're going to put in the work. We're going to come up with those arguments so that a decade from now, it's 70-30 our way rather than 70-30 the other way. The amount of headaches from religious leaders who were promoting lies about the human person. And that makes it harder for parents trying to raise their kids in the truth. And what that meant was that there had to be other religious leaders who would actually defend orthodoxy, right? If you have like these media friendly kind of like, your media pastor, your media priest who's giving these interviews, in essence, promoting heresy, you then need to train up people who are ready to defend orthodoxy. About a decade ago, Mary Hassan created a program here at EPPC called the Person and Identity Project. And what they'll do is they'll go in and they'll provide day-long training sessions for all of the priests in a diocese. So every diocese normally has like a priest retreat convocation each year for continuing education, for refreshment, renewal. One of the things the bishop could do is have Mary and her team come in and give a day-long presentation on how, what are the claims of gender ideology? What is the truth of the matter? How do you preach on this? What should your parish policies be? What should your school policies be if you have a parish school? They've done the same things for school superintendents, principals, teachers. They have various toolkits. There's a pastoral handbook that they've produced. There's a teacher toolkit. There's a school administrator toolkit. And again, these are type of things like once you've created these resources, you can then make them available to people all across the country. And I mean, it's not just even domestically. I mean, Mary has been helping um, religious leaders internationally in Europe, I think even in Asia. I mean, like there are people who recognize the expertise that she has, seeks her out. Sometimes, it's only over Zoom because she can't travel all the way to, I think one time it was the Philippines or somewhere, but you can set up the Zoom, you can do the presentations, some of the print resources like the pastoral handbook. It's a big old thick printed handbook. Some of the toolkits are PDF files, et cetera, et cetera. But that kind of brings people up to speed. Because if you went to seminary, let's say 20 years ago, and you're doing all of your church history and you're doing all of your various Christology, Trinitarian, the heresies, the orthodoxy, the T in LGBT probably wasn't in the syllabus because 20 years ago, none of us knew what the T meant. But if you're now a pastor and you have a church school, you need to get caught up to speed. And the nice thing about Mary is that she has both a degree in theology and she has a law degree. And so she gets both like the legal realities, what sort of liability, what do I need to do to make sure my school policies are airtight should we one day be sued? But also like, what do we need to do to make sure that our school policies are true and they promote and reflect the truth about the human person? And to get both of those expertise in the same person, that's incredibly valuable. With the right resources, we can create shares at EPPC to really launch people's career, knowing that they're going to have, in essence, something like tenure, where they can come here, and so long as the research that they're doing is true, it's accurate, they don't have to worry about the blowback of public opinion. Our scholars write on controversial issues, but they tell the truth about those issues. And so, one of the areas that I could easily see us growing in the next 50 years is to, in essence, have endowed chairs here at EPPC where people know that they can be doing the research, the scholarship on generational questions. They don't always have to be worrying about like what's the 24-hour news cycle or what's the next kind of electoral battle, short-term priorities, but how do I set myself for a generational vision with generational change, and to have the base of support to get that work done, even if the New York Times or the Washington Post's write some nastygrams about me. Look, we don't take government money, so everything we do here is supported by generous benefactors, and we try to pay a living wage, but most of our scholars they have families and they live in the DC area, so it's not an inexpensive place to live. It's not an inexpensive place to raise a family. Many of the schools, at least the government-run schools, have gone woke. So private school tuition, there's all sorts of costs, and none of this is possible apart from the generous benefactors who want to partner with us because they say, "I've been blessed by the Lord in a business endeavor. You've been blessed with your intellect and with your ability to do the research, do the writing, do the speaking. You're defending the truth. You're doing it courageously. You're doing it charitably. And this can be kind of a partnership in which I want to see these truths vindicated in the public square. I have some resources that I can partner with you so that you can then fulfill your vocation." And I think about this in a vocational way of, there are things that God's calling each and every one of us to do. And some of that's going to be in the commercial business sphere. Some of that's going to be in the intellectual academic sphere, the political arena. And for those of us who are laboring kind of on the intellectual, cultural policy side, we can't do it without the support and the partnership of those who are being successful in the business side, but also vice versa. I think this is the type of thing where if we're successful, it's going to be to the benefit of everyone's grandkids, right? We're going to have a much more humane America and a much more robust set of religious institutions. And that's going to lead to increased human flourishing, not just for ourselves, but for our posterity. I mean, I think there are four truths written on the human heart. So part of the natural law, but they're also so important that God revealed them on the first page of the Bible. And these are kind of like the central questions of today's, hot button debates. And it's that we're made in the image and likeness of God. It's that we're created male and female. It's that men and women are created for each other in marriage. And it's that all of us are created for friendship with God. And, when I outline those truths, they then correspond to some of the most important, but also controversial cultural and political questions of our day that were made in the image and likeness of God. All of our debates about human dignity, whether it's the beginning of life or the end of life, whether it's embryo destruction, whether it's abortion, whether it's euthanasia, assisted suicide, it's that truth that we have intrinsic worth and dignity. It's not about what we can do, it's about who we are. Our value is not because we can contribute to the GDP or that we're beautiful or that we're athletic. It's because we're made in God's image and likeness, and therefore we have equality because we have moral equality. That we're created male and female. I mean, all of the transgender ideology that we've lived through for the past decade, that's a direct frontal challenge to that truth that we're created male and female. Every one of my grandparents knew that, not just because the Bible said so, but because it was just self-evident. It was obvious. And yet here we actually need scholarship to push back on a series of lies that were made for marriage. Our marriage rates are the lowest they've ever been in the United States. Our fertility rates, the lowest they've ever been. Children are a blessing, and we should be thinking through what we can do to support marriage and the family and marital childbearing and marital parenting. And there's just so much to do there, but the threats that the family has faced in both law and culture over the past 2 generations, we still need an effective response to the sexual revolution. And then the fact that we're all made in the image and likeness of God means that we're also all made for friendship with God. And that's where so many of our religious liberty debates take place. And yet we've seen, the New York Times and other publications will put it in scare quotes, so-called religious liberty, as if it's not a real civil right. But then it also means that we need to revitalize our religious institutions, right? Religious liberty for what? Religious liberty for religious orthodoxy, right? And so it shouldn't just be that we care about religious liberty, but we care about religious liberty precisely for the flourishing of our houses of worship. The most important thing that I have to do as president is to recruit and mentor the next generation of socially conservative, religiously orthodox, politically, civically minded scholars who want to step into the fray. My job here is to make sure that we have Jewish, Protestant, Catholic, and possibly others, right, who share a certain understanding of the human person, who can then deploy their intellectual gifts in defense of the truth about human nature and human dignity and human identity and human flourishing on whatever the next issue is going to be. And so to a certain extent, like what I'm thinking through is, how can I create a stable of action-oriented thought leaders to be ready to kind of like step into the breach for whatever the next ideological challenge is going to be? Truthful. And the reason why is that, we live in an era that has given up on even the concept of truth, right? We live in an era that's skeptical about the truth, that thinks you have your truth and I have my truth. Relativism, subjectivism reigns supreme. And scholars at EPPC kind of like stake all of our work on the proposition that there is a truth. There's a truth about the human person. There's a truth about justice. There's a truth about ethics. And all of those things should influence what good public policy looks like. And so to a certain extent, what we're doing at EPPC is trying to get every one of our man-made laws to reflect the truth about the human person.